Here we go then. So thanks guys for joining us. And I think we've got three important industries represented here. We've got mining, we've got metals, and then we've got the recycling sector as well. So between the three of you, you're representing the whole food chain, so to speak, from the initial extraction through to production, and then post-consumer, what do we do with this once we've actually used it? But I'd like to begin with getting your views on what you see as the difference between recycling and upcycling, and what you see as how economics can play a part in that. So I'll invite whichever one wants to speak first on that.
I can jump in. From my understanding here, the recycling side of things is kind of just the old school thoughts of, you know, how you take something and how you just cut it down and repurpose it into something completely different. This is actually finding new monetization and new value with waste products become their own products themselves. And so upcycling takes it from just you know, say you'd have a chunk of something, you cut it down to small pieces and then you just melt it down, turn it into something else. This is finding whole new lines of economics that go with those products. That's kind of how I see it.
Mm.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Garett. In terms of the mining side, I mean, big part of the challenges we face is really the tailings and waste rock that is produced through mining. There's not really too much we can do in terms of pure recycling, which is essentially not changing in its actual form and reusing it in some way. So I'm quite focused on ways we could potentially use the tailings as an example in terms of upcycling it and really try and change it into some sort of value add input into other industries. And in that way, very simply try to remove the waste or at least minimize it. And in that way, try and reduce the risk for the mining industry and the company itself. Pete?
Pete, yeah, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting, it's kind of a buzzword, right, to upcycle something for consumers. And I think what I would say is it's really important for everyone to know that consumer recycling is the part that the consumer does is really only a small part of what is actually happening out there in recycling. It's actually a big industrial system where, you know, you have thousands of tons of material coming into a center being processed and sent out. And upcycling or recycling, you know, in an industrial sense is a lot more complicated and important, I dare say, than taking, for example, an old tube from a bike tire and figuring out how to make a bracelet out of it. Or, you know, we need to solve these bigger problems like what Malcolm is saying. You know, what do we do with what is a waste product today to upcycle it into something that maximizes its value?
Yeah, and how do we get at that material in an economic way so that people can get enough of it economically to make it worthwhile as well? What are your views on the issues surrounding that? I mean, particularly you, Pete, because you're the person who's trying to get at that material. Yeah,
I guess maybe just a brief introduction into what my business does, and that'll help shed some light into it. So my business, KC Recycling, we recycle two main product categories. One is consumer electronics, so television sets, old DVD players, phones. And then the other product is car batteries, which contain lead, acid, and plastic. So, you know, both of these programs are already part of the extended producer responsibility, right? Which means that the producer who makes the product is also responsible to make sure at the end of life it makes it to a place like ours. So your question about getting access to those materials, the biggest challenge over and over again is logistics, right? So we are continually trying to move material in and move material out. And we're a fairly small processor. We're the smallest processor of electronics in British Columbia, for example, right? But we still see, say, 20 to 30 truckloads coming and going every day. And so the logistics and the cost of freight, and not just the cost of it, but we have to get the material in and out every day. So it has to be something that flows. We can't be storing material and scheduling different trucks. They have to be coming and going on a regular basis. So that logistics problem is really critical. And for us to do business with a new partner, for example, that's always a thing we have to evaluate in trials. Can we get a steady supply chain going from a logistics perspective?
I think to touch on a little bit too is I think the ultimate goal with the upcycling is that everybody's trying to work towards a zero waste kind of thing. That to have waste as a byproduct of what we do is something that we want to just try to remove that word as being waste at all. My job, you know, we're metals recycling. We're just kind of old school where you cut the metal down, reprocess it, take it to the mines, or take it back to the mills, and they reprocess it for other purposes. Other products, other companies, they create different types of waste, but those wastes have monetary values. And back to what Pete said about logistics, Canada has an abundance of riches, whether it's land or resources, these types of things. With that land becomes another issue with logistics. Everything's really, really spread apart. To get it from point A to point B, you know, you see this product as being a waste, but potentially can be exploited and have economic value to it. But can you get it? Lots of our mines are in locations where you can't get to them. You know, smaller cities, you know, it just doesn't make monetary sense to get things in small truckloads out to different locations. So creating this industrial economy, circular economy, and making everybody kind of team up and see where the money is, where the waste is being, has been a huge good motivating thing for companies to see that these types of things are happening.
And Malcolm, lots of big tailing. You've got lots of piles of tailings that might have fundamentally very valuable material in it. So you're facing an economic hill to get that material that could prevent new mines having to be opened.
That's a bold statement. I don't know if I'd go that far, but it could definitely add some value to the economic system. I think touching on what Garett said, I think what we've seen, at least in terms of some examples, is that it's not just technical challenges we face in terms of the tailings and what we could potentially use it for. The uses are very specific based on the composition of the tailings itself, which differs from mine site to mine site, especially depending on what process is being used to process the ore. But I think a very good point what Garett makes is that a lot of times the mine sites are in very remote locations. So not just the infrastructure may not be there, it may be there sometimes, but the cost of actually taking whatever you have produced to market may make it uneconomical to actually do. So the technical challenge, there are obviously technical challenges, but I would say that it's not the only challenge, and sometimes economics just does not make it viable. I think that really touches on the bigger picture to try and involve other stakeholders who would see potential value in that new input into their value system. And by other people or other stakeholders, I sort of refer to other industries that may see value in our waste product that we don't see value in. In addition, local governments or provincial governments who may see benefit in terms of investing in infrastructure and also creating incentives to essentially allow that, movement of material to be economically viable. To allow that to happen just from purely a free market standpoint is, I think, a large ask. And I think it just would be helped if it did have, other non-private industry support to do that. It would help diversify the local economies, that's for sure.
And where do you see things like extended producer responsibility coming into this, particularly with electronics, like small electronics, where trying to get the economic value out of them can be quite difficult because they're so small and there's so little of the material in each individual product that's produced. But when you bulk it all up, there's quite a lot of it, but to get to it makes it quite difficult.
Yeah, I think an important thing to understand is these programs have to evolve over time to adapt to the changes in pricing of commodities, in the design of the products, the recyclability of the products. So, for example, the Consumer Electronic Extended Producer Responsibility Program, I believe, is the consumer gets charged a fee based on the weight of the product that then goes into this pool to then recycle it. And that, years ago when we were talking about big console television sets, and that was a reasonable way to subsidize the recycling of it, because the weight of the wood and the weight of the glass and everything sort of corresponded to the cost to process it. Now, when we're talking about smaller electronics like AirPods that have hazardous material in them, like lithium-ion batteries, and not much weight at all, right? Now the cost is truly in the handling of the product, the dismantling of the product. Even though it doesn't have much weight to it, it still has a lot of cost to process, and the material value of what's in there might be very different, might be minimal compared to what was in an old television set where there was more copper or steel or whatever of value. So it's these programs have to be somehow in flux based on the values of commodities or the costs of treating them. And it's really important that that the public policy experts, I guess, tackle that challenge to make a framework so that businesses like ours can invest for the long term, right? If things fluctuate with commodity prices, it's very hard to set up businesses with, the right economics.
Yeah. Sorry, Michael.
Oh, I was just going to say, just on that point, I completely agree with Pete. I mean, I guess policy needs to adapt and be flexible as I guess new products come to market and it becomes the, majority source in terms of the waste. And also I think one key thing to add is, I know the Canadian, I think it's Natural Resources, have just released their critical metals that will be in demand over the next few years as we transition to more of a green economy. And so even though you may have small amounts of certain metals, they actually may be quite valuable. So it changes from a weight sort of, metric to be using to maybe something else. Maybe we need to clearly identify what materials are actually in these smaller products that can then be, recycled in a better way, so that you still extract the value while not just dismissing it because it just doesn't have a lot of weight. Yeah.
I would say that's like super important too, like as far as knowing what's available, what's out there. If we know it's on a list and it's this is a precious metal, this is something that Canada is going to need to have. Even just people being aware of what's available. I know we talked about potential like a waste registry of it. When you have a product you put together, this is the product that I put out, these are the wastes that we potentially create. Having that on a list somewhere where somebody can be like, holy, that's exactly what I need for my product, or that kind of thing. It fosters that, plus being able to create new technology where you can be like, at some point, Pete said that with these AirPods, there's just such a minute amount of material that you're trying to get out of it. There's so much processing involved. Maybe eventually there'll be a push to be like, we have set aside some money for new tech to be able to process these things better, to be able to get these things processed and to reduce that waste. It's all something that has to go together, because going off of weight and making things old school, say, well, this is how much we have 10 kilos of this and this and that. But if you have to run it through a machine, grind it down and get just like, a kilo out of it, doesn't make sense. So those are the types of things where, like you say, you can have some sort of registries and a little bit of government regulation on how to be able to put money aside to push these things.
Yeah, and accessing it as well, like you say. One of the problems you've got is where the availability of it is small amount and diffuse, whereas the requirement is large amount in a single production area. And without things like take back and incentives for take back, you struggle for somebody to say, well, this is a tiny little thing, I'm just going to put it in the bin, and then you've lost that material because it's got lost in the street, the general waste stream. So yeah, there's a lot there that needs to be thought about, doesn't it?
Just one point there, James. I think one big part of the circular economy in terms of principles is essentially trying to design out waste, and I think it applies both to new products, like Pete mentioned in terms of an example, AirPods or some other electronic. Basically, trying to design it better so it can be recycled better or easier. Same applies, I guess, to the mining industry in a way. Not exactly, but it's really about understanding what potential metals, even though they might not be large amounts, and may not even be part of a mining company's main business stream, but if they realize that it potentially has economic value, why not look at potentially mining it as well? That essentially would reduce the waste that comes out of it, or at least have a cleaner product that could be used as a input to another industry. I know some of our industry peers are looking at that, and I think they're calling it full value mining, where they're basically looking at what other potential metals and minerals can they potentially get from the ore resource. Essentially, it's optimizing the mining in terms of what you're actually looking to get out, and thereby reducing the waste. Yeah. So I don't think we should forget about the design component at the beginning.
Absolutely, that's important, and I think all of this together brings us to our next area of our next topic, which was quality of material. Really, how do you get good quality material? How do you get it so it's not contaminated or mixed? If you've got lots of different electronic, lots of different material in different types of electronic waste, for example, you need to be able to segregate, especially if there's small amounts. You need to be able to segregate at minute levels. So how do we address the problem of contamination?
Again, it's something that it's critically important. I'll give you an example. We have been recycling car batteries for many, many decades. Lead acid batteries are the highest recycled product in the history of humans, right? Like 99% of car batteries are recycled fully. So it's a great story. Now we start to see lithium-ion batteries replace some lead acid batteries in some applications. And when a lithium-ion battery gets into our stream, right, if it's on a pallet with a bunch of lead acid batteries and we can't identify it, if it goes through our machinery, it will destroy it, right? It'll absolutely destroy it, potentially hurt people. We've invested a lot in safety and everything. But there's no labeling standards. There's nothing yet to help you identify that it is lithium ion instead of a lead acid battery, right? There's no way of doing it visually. There's no way of making sure that the auto repair shop identifies it and separates it, right? There really isn't anything, and it will, in the end, if we don't take that step, it will cause some, pretty unexpected negative consequences. And that's in our most recycled product ever, right? We have one change in the economy and we haven't dealt with how it affects the recyclability of it. That becomes a huge problem. So I think, for example, for us to put in an automated system that will scan, batteries as they go through and reject a lithium ion battery might cost us more than building a whole new plant. Right, it's a new technology, and when you start getting into those types of economics, people will start to exit the business before they put in their own sorting equipment.
Yeah, I'll just touch on that. I think Pete raises some good points there, and I think it really leads on to one. Like essentially what Pete's talking about is new products. You probably might need new processes or machinery to actually dismantle them in an economic way. If the existing technology doesn't exist or doesn't suit that, then some R&D is probably required. And not all companies have that luxury to have an R&D budget and division. So I think that's really where I think government incentives can really help in terms of providing some sort of incentives for companies to be willing to take those risks, other smaller players coming to market and putting time and effort, as well as universities into that, and then obviously trying to take it to some sort of level of commercialization to essentially help the ecosystem. That's really what we need. I know within in terms of mining, I mean, tailings that comes out, we have to look at ways of trying to see how we could potentially reprocess it in some way to make it a valuable product. That has taken a bit of investment on our side internally, but it definitely would help if there were incentives out there for other organizations to putting in the time and effort to also tackle the problem, which then would help other, I guess, stakeholders along the value chain. So basically, I think it's really trying to invest in the needs of the new ecosystem that's required, this industrial ecosystem. Is that a good way, I guess, Pete, in terms of touching on some points that you're mentioning? I think that's
you made a really great point that about the R&D. Some companies don't have the luxury to have R&D, right? I have a very small business. our engineering team is very, very small. But the knowledge that's out there with other businesses or universities or government programs or whatever is incredibly valued and still needs to be applied in a business like ours. So there's not just developing that technology or that research, there's also, I think you called it the commercialization of it, right? How do you take that research and get it in place at businesses of all size and location, right? They need help to adapt a new technology and put it in place, right? Not just financial help, but actual implementation help, right? How do you take something and actually get it out there once that knowledge is developed?
Yeah, and one of the things I want to ask Garett as well about post-consumer waste and contamination levels in the sorts of things that you have is, do you feel that the potential level of contamination is appreciated to the degree it needs to be? So I'm going to talk about an example of a project that we did once where we were talking about the levels of aluminium that can be recycled. And the project leads were convinced that should be near 100% because they just had no appreciation of the level of contamination that can exist and what effect that can have on processing plants who are set up to actually do it.
I think what is misunderstood with that is that the like our company, like a lot of the money that we make in our non-ferrous department is because of being able to upgrade. That trickles down to what everything costs. If the market's really high, it's because there's so much processing and all that kind of stuff is involved with it. If we get stuff in and you just see it's a big cabinet, it's a steel cabinet. Well, it's got copper inside. It's got all these things that you can break down, but do you have the power? Is there enough money in it to break it down to the smaller components to say, okay, here's the copper, here's the aluminum, here's the steel, do that. So sometimes you're just like at the point where you're like, well, here's the raw weight of it. We can get this in steel. So send it out and melt it down as steel. And you lose a lot with that. And without having the manpower to break it down, to take it and classify it between, like you say, with your aluminum brands, you can have really clean aluminum that you get top dollar for, but then you have dirty aluminum that you can get lower end for. But at some point, if you have half of this, half of that, you kind of somewhere in the middle. So there's a lot more money to be made, and that's a lot of what we do is that upscaling. So it is super important. I think it's just mostly as an efficiency thing. If you're able to offer incentives to say that, hey, this is the new product, this is what it is, let's work with somebody as it's coming out, back to the smaller electronics, that kind of thing. What we do, the recycling, the upscaling, the industrial economy, that's kind of like a lagging indicator of what's going on with tech. You bring stuff out, you see these small, and all of a sudden the market's like, oh, we have all these products, and then all of a sudden someone like KC sees these little products showing up, and they're like, well, what are we supposed to do with these? Like, we haven't got to the point where this is 10-year-old technology, but now it's starting to all fail, and we're starting to see that. If you have those incentives and you work together with R&D or have a circular economy working together to say, these are the products we're coming out with, these are the potential wastes before they even hit the market, and have something in place, it's not a shock where you bring down a whole facility because you've taken in something that it can't handle. And it offers that ability to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that kind of brings us in some way, a lot of what we've discussed comes to infrastructure here, where we're linking R&D and infrastructure and setup, where we may well have a whole infrastructure around the products that we had, but new products demand new infrastructure, or they demand a new infrastructure of how we actually deal with them. And how do you see that? We've got the standard infrastructure that we look at, and things like transport and location and things like that. But then new smaller products need a whole new type of infrastructure to get them into a situation that they can be used and they can be upcycled at the end of their life.
What's interesting, we've solved this problem in non-recycling applications before. So I early in my career, I was an engineer at Ford. And when Ford introduces a new technology, they need to make sure that their service network out there can work on it, right? And so as part of introducing, I worked there 20 years ago. So a new technology back then was like a a CVT, a continuously variable transmission, right? There's obviously a lot more state of the art today, but when we started shipping that product, we immediately at the time of shipping it required all the dealerships to invest in a new computer, troubleshooting equipment and the tools that went into it, right? And it was part of their capital budget for the coming year in order to sell that product. And so that way, when that product went into market, it was able to be serviced, right? That's as far as Ford was taking it at the time, right? It should also be how's that product at the end of life being treated, and not just in terms of, do we have a program to capture it, but is that technology deployed, right? Our businesses like mine or Tervita's or wherever able to receive that product and properly dispose of it. I think we can look to other systems where we have solved this before, like, for example, automotive service. I'm sure there's dozens of examples where when we introduce new products, we also introduce the technology to take care of it during its life cycle.
Yeah, and the trick is, how do you get that sort of activity embedded in the recycling industry together with the manufacturing industry, so that manufacturers know what's coming out and inform the recycling sectors that this is going to come. And I think it goes back to the design issue that Malcolm spoke about a long time ago in this conversation, where in the designing, you're then working that through to, well, what happens at the end of the life of this, and have we got the infrastructure, and then how do we square that circle? How do we fit the things that are missing? But then how do we fund that type of infrastructure change that's needed? With Ford, like you say, it was part of their capital budget, and they were linked to Ford, but the recycling industry isn't necessarily linked to specific companies that are going, well, my role in this is I've got to get this out and sell it, but then what do you do with it when it's dead?
I think that's really what we're doing kind of with this industrial circular economy, is that within our small area, we're able to go to our partners within this and say, hey, this is what we're doing here. Is there anybody with capacity to help in this area? A lot of this stuff and the new tech and the new recycling is going to have to, probably because of our logistics issues we talked to, you're going to be specifically chose a location where a new facility is going to be built because it's next to this facility, and this facility, and we can get it out with logistics. We can get it out, ship it out, and that kind of thing. And that's why these, little groups pretty decent sized group for our small area, to have that industrial economy, to be able to reach out to partners to say that, hey, we're creating this new thing. Are you guys involved? Can you help out? Can you lend a hand with that?
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing, because that brings us to the industrial ecology and the circular economy as we do this. And my background's obviously industrial symbiosis, where we are looking at connecting companies together, producers and people that can make use of the waste that is being produced. And for us, waste is just another resource in the wrong location that somebody else can make use of. But if you're now looking at saying, well, let's look at this right at the start when we're producing our factories, where we're going to locate ourselves, who is around us, then we're talking about information availability now, aren't we? We're looking at who has that information, how do we get that information, and how do we make use of that information?
A very good point you raised there. I think if that sort of perspective is taken during the design phase, the companies themselves can really benefit essentially by finding a potential synergy with a company that could actually remove the waste and take it away. I know that would be very useful from a mining perspective if we could find companies that could happily use our waste product and essentially remove our risk. So I think companies in the past potentially have maybe just looked at it just from their perspective. But I definitely think there'd be value in terms of having a broader network and understanding potentially different stakeholders within a certain region, both in the private sector as well as at different government levels, because there may be different government planning initiatives that are on the horizon that a certain company isn't aware of. But if the company is aware of it, then there could be a potential benefit to design it in a certain location or place it in a certain location to essentially align with their plans.
There's also a huge financial opportunity there too. If you're going to the bank and saying, hey, I have this new product we're coming out, and you already have a buyer, you already have a company who's like, hey, if you create that, I want this, this, and this from you. That's huge financial. You'll be able to get, you get the loan you needed, get that kind of thing, all the startup cash, because you already have sales before you even have the product.
Which I guess brings in things like regional planning. So, who's already around and who is being attracted to the area, and how do you then use all of that information in a holistic manner? I mean, we in NISP, when we're running NISP in the UK, we had instances where we would have a company and they would have different potential locations, but ultimately they were making decisions based on, well, where is the material that we want? But then they started to realize that actually, if they looked wider and they had a wider remit with regards to their waste resources, then they could start to look at, well, how many options do I have? And if I locate here, I've got 3 companies that might be able to make use of my wastes. And if I locate here, well, I've got 7 companies that can make use of my waste, and they're able to use different aspects of my waste. And then I've also got other companies that might be able to supply resources to me, as opposed to me using virgin resources.
I think that you mentioned the regional view of regional planning, and what you're describing sort of looking at potential outlets for your waste products as part of that, right? And when you think about regional planning, I mean, there are so many different waste products that come out of an urban area, for example, right? And we don't necessarily think about where those waste products are going to go and how to get them back to, an input as a new product. And so what ends up happening, for example, it's pretty well known right now that some amount of plastics are ending up in the ocean. And that's because after they're collected in these urban centers, they're then loaded into containers and shipped to jurisdictions that maybe don't have the same environmental protections or worker protections or whatever, and somehow they end up, being disposed of into the waterways. And we, as a sort of developed economy, have gotten together now and said, no, we're not going to allow the export of plastics anymore. If you collect plastics, you need to deal with it regionally, which is forcing provinces and states around the world to develop a regional plan about, okay, where are we going to actually recycle this plastic? And so it's an example, I think, of by making a slight change in public policy, right, where we say, okay, no more exporting, is forcing a regional plan to develop throughout the world. And we can do that with all kinds of commodities and products, right? You just have to we don't need the government to solve things for industry. We just need the policy that kind of puts in place the economic need to solve things regionally versus perhaps the easy button, so to speak, which is to export it to a place that will deal with it in their own way.
I think there's a little bit of stigma removal too, as well as important as, recycling, that kind of thing, industrial recycling. There is so much regulation involved with it. It's not something that, you're just doing it in your backyard with a hammer. There is a lot of regulation. There's a lot that has to go behind these types of things, and having a facility like KC or Trevita in your backyard is a good thing. We're doing the best we can to make sure that we're abiding to all the regulations and going over and above what we can. Creating, regional areas, we've done it in the past. There's industrial complexes. There's a reason that every city has industrial complexes, because we kind of work with each other. We need to kind of maybe see ourselves less as being competitors in the same role as being partners in this, to make sure that everybody's maximizing everything they can do.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned something very interesting there, Garett, where you're talking about not seeing each other as competitors, but rather seeing each other as part of a chain. So, one company can extract one piece of value, and then the next company can extract the next piece of value. But what we need is, as well, is that information chain and flow between companies, and this understanding that one person doesn't have to try and do everything, because that actually might make it uneconomical for them. Whereas, do you look to get series of niche processes running next to each other and companies that are running in a complementary way?
Lots of times competitive natures of the way that we do stuff, it sometimes turns into a race to the bottom. I mean, if you're after the same piece of pie, you cut it up, and then eventually you're just losing money on it, and it's not good for anybody. To a point, you need to make sure that everything's viable and everything's economic for the consumer, that type of thing. But it is very important to see each other as partners, period, I think.
Yeah. And I think that brings me to, say, NIST Canada, where, that was a facilitated service for industrial symbiosis and getting companies to work together and understand the opportunities from both a resource aspect, from an R&D aspect, and an economic aspect, and helping those companies realize the opportunities that are presented to them. Now, NIST and in the UK and NIST Canada are free at the point of delivery to companies, that they were funded services. How important do you see that from a point of view of as a service, as what it can do? And how important do you see it as, does it need to be free, or is it something that you could see as a marketable, chargeable service?
Could you elaborate on that service for all of our benefit?
Yeah, sure. So what happens is you have what are called practitioners, and they work with companies to look at the resource inputs and the resource outputs from a company. And they have a network, and then they match those resource inputs and outputs information to bring companies together and identify potential matches between those companies. So instead of sending waste to landfill or incineration, you find an economic beneficial use, and they can work with the companies to help, vision cast really the opportunity itself within the company, but also bring the companies together through meetings and moving samples between, identifying where the R&D expertise might be that will help them actually realize any gaps that they've got. So it's that type of facilitation service for companies.
Thank you, James. The issue, if you leave implementation only to business, is business will always chase the things that drive the most profits, right? That drive the most money. That's not always what is most important for a community or for the ecosystem in general, right? Sometimes something has ancillary benefits or problems like economic, importance nationally, or environmental issues where we need somehow for businesses to adopt things that might not be the highest priority financially, but are still worthwhile adopting. And I think that's where, if there's something that's strategic for whatever reason, right, for health reasons, environmental reasons, national security reasons, those programs do need to be, I don't know about free, I don't know, but they need to help a company to get all the way to implementation, or else a company will always deprioritize it if it's not sort of the highest level financial return.
I think you raise a couple of good points there, Pete. And I think as a service, it would definitely be very useful for a number of different companies within different industries, just very simply because they don't have the knowledge or network in terms of understanding the broader regional players who may actually see value in their waste product. So just even having that as almost I guess a facilitation, like you mentioned, in terms of a matching type of service, analysis and matching type of service, I think there's tremendous value in that. And I actually think there's a gap right now that is there that can fill.
Mm.
Another side of that too is, I think what Pete touched on is just saying that, opportunities and they just need to be seen with rebates and instead of fines. You know what I mean? And the way of operating, you get taxed for a certain level of carbon or that kind of thing. But if you're able to diversify your portfolio and go into areas where people are maybe not seeing it as attractive, but to have rebates involved with it, that's, you might attract more economics that way.
Yeah, I agree with that. And coupled with that, yeah, lots of how the policy of how do you incentivize this type of activity, isn't it? Really, like you said, you can use a stick or you can use a carrot, and a fine is a stick and a rebate is a carrot. And how you structure your policy can have a marked impact on how people relate to that policy and want to, grasp it and thrive with it, or do it begrudgingly.
And buy into public, the public sees it, and if it's not done for the right reason, you might see through it and just say, well, here's another fee that goes on top of everything else and make it living more expensive. If you see that as being an opportunity and being like, hey, this company is going after this big rebate or this big, that's another pushing force, right?
Yeah, I think just in general, I mean, some sort of incentive like that would definitely help companies in general who are probably focused on one type of service offering or sort of a product that they're producing. Typically looking at ways to change their waste in some way or reduce their waste and make it an input into another industry isn't really top of mind from their business perspective, because it's not their main service offering. So having some sort of incentive like that will help companies essentially be willing to put some time and effort to actually look at ways of reusing their waste and creating value out of them for other industries. So I think it's definitely very useful if that type of framework is in place.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, we're actually out of time. So I thank you for a very stirring and interesting discussion. There's loads of things that we didn't even get to, things like, the importance of data and how can we share data and things like that. And then further discussions on policy and just how do we incentivize companies to be able to work together. But I thank you for your contributions, and I wish you all the best in your